the Garry Weddell case. When I was first sent the documents in this case, and I was informed by Bedfordshire Police that they suspected that the husband, Garry Weddell, had authored the alleged suicide note found in the vicinity of Sandra Weddell's body, I was very sceptical. I guess I couldn't believe that an inspector in the London Met could have murdered his wife. It seemed inconceivable to me. And in fact, my initial advice to Bedfordshire Police was that there's nothing here. I cannot see anything of linguistic value that would assist the court in any way. But the officers insisted that they felt that there was something not right about the case. And so I was persuaded to look at the documents again. And I employed a technique which I've used on a number of occasions. And that is, quite simply, I either memorize a document and can visualize it with the punctuation and the line breaks, or I transcribe it over and over again until perhaps, but not always, something emerges. And in the Weddell case, three attributes of Garry Weddell's use of language, not handwriting, but his language, emerged. And the first was the full stop after the salutation. So the suicide note begins, "Dear Garry, full stop," and then a new line. And this is very unusual. Most people will use a comma or no punctuation at all. In America, it's quite common to use a colon after the initial salutation. The second thing that I noticed was, and again this was as a result of transcribing time and time again the alleged suicide letter, the second thing I noticed was that the sentences tended to be very short. And the average of those sentences in length was 10 words. And then the third thing I noticed was that Garry Weddell always put his name in the middle of the paper. So he would write a letter, and then at the end, in the middle of, a bit right in the centre between the two margins, would be his signature, his name. And one oddity in this respect with regard to the suicide letter that the victim was allegedly writing to her husband, but she signed her name in full, Sandra Jane Weddell. So I looked at these three things, and I then examined all of the writing by Sandra Weddell. At that moment, I still didn't conceive that Garry was the author. I then looked to see whether the letters which were known to have been written by Sandra, what kind of features they exhibited. And they exhibited none of the features that I have mentioned that I found in the suicide note, the alleged suicide note. And then finally I looked at Garry Weddell's letters that he'd written to a number of people, and they all bore these three hallmarks. So he would write, "Dear Pete, full stop." And the sentences would typically be short. As a matter of fact, Sandra's letters, the average sentence length there was about 28 to 30 words. The average sentence length of Garry's letters was also 10 words, exactly the same as the alleged suicide note. And Garry also signed his name in the middle, as was the case with the suicide note, alleged suicide note, and he also had this tendency to have very short sentences. So there were these very striking similarities. So I concluded that it was possible, in fact likely, that Garry was the author. I had no statistical way to prove that. But I would say, with the wisdom of a lot of experience after that, this is going back 14 years now, time has shown me that even in a case like that, where you find great similarities between a suspect's use of language and a known author's use of language, one still needs to be very cautious. You have to remember the alleged suicide note was only about 150, 180 words long. It was very short. We had no other question samples, only that one sample. So that is a good reason to be cautious about considering whether authorship can be attributed or not. And I very seldom go past a possible author. I might occasionally say a likely author, but because I think it is very, very important not to get in the court's way. The court will be aware of a lot of evidence that the expert is not aware of, and rightfully so. I don't think the expert should know any more than they absolutely have to. And in that case, I didn't. And in fact, I make it a habit never to know more than I absolutely have to. I don't want to know the facts of the case beyond what I need to do my analysis. So that was my experience with the Garry Weddell case. And sadly, Garry Weddell was allowed out on bail shortly after he'd been, not long after he'd been arrested. He was allowed out on bail, and in that time he killed his mother-in-law and himself. So a very tragic ending to that case.